She was 41 years old, and by the first frost of that autumn, she had nowhere left to sleep but a hired room above a feed store, and even that would be gone within the week. Her name did not matter yet to the town of Cormorant Point, Maine, but her brother-in-law's did, for it was Thomas of Burley who had put her out of the house her own sister had died in, claiming the deed had always been his and that grief was no excuse for a woman to forget her place. All she had left in this world was $11 sewn into the hem of her coat, a trunk of her sister's letters, and a stubbornness that had not yet learned to call itself pride. So when the county auctioneer stood on the courthouse steps that gray October morning and offered the old Gold Point light in its keeper's cottage, abandoned 9 years, condemned by the harbor board, its lens dark and its stairs rotted through, nobody in that crowd so much as raised a hand. Nobody but her. She paid $4 for a lighthouse the whole town had given up for dead, and not one soul there knew that sealed behind its keeper's room wall was a letter that would not only save her life, but would one day pull an entire fishing village back from the edge of ruin. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ruth and Calder. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, we want you to know we see you, and we're glad you're here. Ruth and Calder had been born 31 years before that October morning in a fishing shanty on the leeward side of Cormorant Point, the second daughter of a lobsterman named Eli Calder and his wife Margaret, who mended nets for half the boats in the harbor and taught her two girls to do the same before either of them could properly read. It was not a house of much money, but it was a house of much order, and Margaret Calder ran it the way she ran her needle, with a patience that seemed to have no bottom to it. Ruth was a quiet one, the watcher, the girl who noticed which knot slipped and which held, who could look at a torn sail and see, before anyone else, exactly where the strain had gathered and where the men needed to go. Her older sister Constance was the bright one, the one who sang while she worked and drew the eye of every young man on the docks, and it surprised no one when, at 19, Constance married Thomas of Burley, a merchant son with a new store on Harbor Street and ambitions that reached well past Cormorant Point. Ruth, then 2 years younger, stayed home longer than most girls did, nursing her mother through a wasting illness that took 18 months to finish its work, and it was in those 18 months that she learned the second great skill of her life, the one that would matter most of all. She learned to sit with silence, to read what a person did not say, and to find the useful thing hidden inside what looked, to everyone else, like nothing at all. Her mother, in her last clear week, had held Ruth's hand and told her that the world would often hand her broken things and call them worthless, and that her whole gift, her whole inheritance, was knowing better. Ruth buried her mother beside her father, who had been lost at sea 3 winters prior, and found herself, at 23, entirely alone, taking in mending and keeping accounts for 2 of the smaller fishing outfits, living frugally, saving what she could, never marrying, never quite trusted by the town to be anything but the quiet, colder girl who kept to herself. Those years alone taught her a third quiet skill, one she would not fully understand the value of until much later, the patience of ledgers. The fishing outfits paid her a small wage to keep their books, to track what came in against what went out, to notice when a captain's numbers didn't sit quite right against the size of his catch, and she grew, without ever meaning to, into a woman who could read a column of figures the way other women read a face, seeing hesitation in a smudged entry, seeing shame in a number crossed out and rewritten smaller. She kept to a narrow room behind the chandlery, ate plainly, wore her mother's old dresses turned and returned until the fabric grew thin as paper, and on Sunday she walked out along the Point Road alone, past the dark shape of the Old Lighthouse standing sentinel over the harbor mouth, never once imagining that the tower would someday belong to her, or that her own grandfather had once climbed its stair every evening at dusk to light the very beacon the town now took for granted. She knew only, in a vague and half-formed way passed down through her mother, that there had once been a Calder who kept that light, and that the family had left it under circumstances nobody spoke of plainly, the way a house avoids mentioning a room with a bad leak rather than admit the roof needs mending. When Constance's health began to fail 9 years later, a slow trouble of the lungs a doctor in Rockland could not name, it was Ruthin who came to nurse her, moving into the fine Burley house on the hill, and it was Ruthin who sat with her sister through the last 2 years of her life while Thomas of Burley's business dealings kept him increasingly and conveniently occupied elsewhere. Constance, in her final months, grew afraid, not of dying, she told Ruthin, but of what Thomas might do once she was gone, and she began to speak, in fragments, of a promise her father had made long before either sister married, a promise tied somehow to the old lighthouse out on Gull Point, though illness clouded her memory before she could ever finish the thought. Ruth held her sister's hand exactly as her mother had once held Hayes, and when Constance died that February, Ruth believed, in her grief, that she had at least done the one thing she knew how to do. She had stayed, she had watched, she had found the men even when there seemed to be none left to find. It did not take Thomas overly long to show Ruth and what her staying had actually earned her. Within a month of the funeral, he informed her, in the flat and businesslike tone he used with his shop clerks, that the house had always been his alone, purchased with his money before the marriage, and that while he was grateful for her nursing, he could no longer justify the expense of housing a sister-in-law who contributed nothing to his household. Ruth, then, who had spent 2 years believing herself useful, understood in that single conversation that she had only ever been tolerated. She asked, quietly, whether Constance had left anything, a letter, a keepsake, some small provision, and Thomas told her, with a coldness you would remember for the rest of her days, that his wife's affairs were his to settle and that Ruth ought to be thankful he wasn't charging her back rent. She was given 11 days to find other lodging. She took a room above Peel's feed store on credit she could not truly afford, carried her trunk of mending tools and her sister's few letters with her, and spent those 11 days walking the harbor road at dusk, doing the sum of her life over and over in her head and arriving, each time, at the same $11. She tried, in those first days, to find honest work to steady herself against what was coming. She called on the fishing outfit she had once kept books for, only to learn that Beau had since hired younger men, cousins, and nephews who needed the wage more visibly than a widow's sister did. She offered her mending skills door to door along Harbor Street, and though a few housewives took pity and gave her small jobs, a torn hem here, a button reset there, the coins she earned barely covered the bread she bought with them. She asked, quietly and with more humility than pride ought to have allowed, whether the church might have use of a woman who could keep accounts, and was told kindly but firmly that the position was already filled by the deacon's own daughter. Each door that closed taught her something new about how thoroughly a town could decide, without ever holding a formal vote on the matter, that a woman was no longer useful to it. She began to notice, too, the particular cruelty of small courtesies, how Thomas of Verla's clerks still tipped their hats to her on the street, how the minister still greeted her warmly after services, as though nothing at all had changed, as though a woman could be put out of her home and still be expected to smile and curtsy and pretend the town owed her nothing further. She was 41 years old with no husband, no children, no property, and a town that had long ago decided who she was and saw no reason to reconsider. She thought, more than once, of leaving Cormoran Point altogether, of taking a coach to Rockland or Bangor and starting over somewhere her name meant nothing at all. But something in her, the same something that had once found the exact place in a torn sail where the strain had gathered, told her to stay one more week. It was in that week that the county posted notice of a courthouse auction, properties seized for unpaid taxes and abandoned claims, and near the bottom of a short list of worthless lots, she saw it, Gull Point Light and Keeper's Cottage, condemned, unoccupied 9 years, to be sold as is to the highest bidder. The morning of the auction was cold and the sky the color of a wet stone, and perhaps 24 townspeople gathered on the courthouse steps mostly for the entertainment of watching the county try to unload properties nobody wanted. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Purnell with a voice built for shouting over harbor wind, moved briskly through the good parcels first, a stretch of grazing land, a half-share in a herring weir, before arriving, almost as an afterthought, at the lighthouse. He read out the description without enthusiasm. Automated beacon installed at the new. Light on Matinicus meant Gull Point had been decommissioned 9 years back. The tower's iron stair rusted through in places. The keeper's cottage roof partly caved, condemned by the harbor board as unsafe, sold as is with no warranty and no refund. He asked for an opening bid of $5 and got silence. He dropped it to $3 and got laughter. Ruth, then, standing near the back with her hands buried in her coat sleeves, felt something turn over inside her chest, some old and familiar instinct rising up through the numbness of the past 11 days, the sense, the one her mother had named for her, that the world was handing her a broken thing and calling it worthless, and that she, of all people gathered on those steps, might actually know better. She raised her hand and said, in a voice steadier than she felt, $4. Purnell looked at her the way a man looks at a joke that has gone on slightly too long, waited a polite few seconds for a second bidder who never came, and brought his gavel down. The crowd's laughter followed her all the way to the clerk's window, where she counted out 4 of her 11 remaining dollars and received, in exchange, a deed to a condemned lighthouse and a claim slip for keys at, the clerk warned her, Likely wouldn't even turn in locks gone to rust. She walked the 2 miles out along the point that same afternoon, her 7 remaining dollars feeling less like a fortune and more like the exact width of the gap between herself and true ruin, and stood at the base of the white tower looking up at a lantern room gone dark and a cottage roof sagging under 9 winters of neglect, and told herself, with more resolve than certainty, that a woman who could mend a net no one else could save could surely find a way to make one room of this place fit, to sleep in before the cold set in for good. The keys did turn, though it took oil and patience and a bent hairpin before the cottage door finally gave. Inside, the air was thick with salt damp and the particular staleness of a room that had not felt a living breath in 9 years, and Ruth had spent her first hours simply opening what shutters would still open, letting grey daylight fall across a single main room with a stone hearth, a narrow bedroom beyond it, and the base of the tower stair rising through a doorway in the far wall. The furniture the previous keeper had left behind was mostly ruined, a bed frame gone soft with rot, a table with one leg collapsed, but the bones of the place were sound, built by men who had understood that a keeper's cottage needed to survive whether that would flatten a lesser house. It was on her second day, while she was on her knees scrubbing 9 years of grime from the hearthstones, that she noticed something odd about the wall to the left of the fireplace, a seam in the plaster that ran a shade too straight, too deliberate, to be simple settling or crack. She pressed a palm flat against it and felt, beneath the plaster, not the solid resistance of stone but a faint hollowness, the particular give of empty space behind a false face. Her hands, trained by years of finding exactly where repair needed to happen, told her before her mind fully caught up that this had been built, not broken. She worked at the seam with the edge of a fire poker, patient the way her mother had taught her to be patient, and after the better part of an hour, a section of plaster and lath the size of a small cupboard door came loose in her hands, revealing a shallow cavity built into the thickness of the chimney wall, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow with age, a small tin box no bigger than a Bible, its lid rusted nearly shut, and beneath the box, tucked flat against the stone, a single folded letter, the ink faded but the hand upon it unmistakably careful, unmistakably old-fashioned, and addressed, in a script that made Ruth and breath catch in her throat, to whoever keeps this light next. She sat back on her heels on that cold hearthstone floor for a long moment before she trusted herself to open it, and when she finally did, working the brittle fold apart with the same care she'd have given a torn sail seam, she found the letter was dated some 43 years earlier and signed by a man named Josiah Calder, her own father's father, a grandfather she had never known, who had kept the Gull Point life for 11 years before the county records, incomplete as they so often were, on the coast, lost track of him entirely. The letter explained, in a keeper's plain and careful hand, that the tin box contained the accumulated wages he had never spent, pay owed him by the Old Lighthouse board that had gone unpaid during a dispute over the light's ownership between the federal government and a private harbor company, wages he had set aside rather than fight for through the courts, along with a small store of gold coin he had traded for over years of careful dealing with passing ships, meant as a provision for whichever of his descendants might one day need it most. But the letter held more than an inheritance. Josiah Calder wrote, with evident grief still fresh even across 4 decades of paper and ink, of the winter of the Great Wreck, a night when a coastal packet called the Nor'wester had gone down on the point's outer ledge in a storm so violent that no rescue boat could be launched, and how he alone, from the tower, had watched 31 souls struggle in black water while the light he tended, sabotaged that same week by men paid off by the rival harbor company hoping to see the federal light decommissioned and their own private beacon contracted in its place, had failed to burn. He named the company. He named the man who had paid the saboteurs. He wrote that he had reported it to the harbor board and been quietly dismissed from service for drunkenness he had never been guilty of, his reputation destroyed by the very men responsible, and that he had left Cormorant Point in disgrace rather than watch his family suffer for a truth no one wanted to hear, taking only what wages were rightfully his and leaving the rest of the record sealed here, in the war the only home that had ever felt honestly his, in the hope that someday, someone, with colder blood and a colder's patience would find it, and would finally set the record straight for the 31 soul the town of Cormorant Point had quietly agreed, for 43 years, to blame on bad weather and an old drunk keeper rather than on the greed of men still respected on Harbor Street. Ruth had read the letter 3 times through before the shape of it fully settled into her, and when it did, she understood 2 things at once, with a clarity that felt almost physical. The first was that she was, however distantly, not simply a woman who had bought a worthless lighthouse for $4, but a granddaughter returning, unknowing to the exact tower her own grandfather had kept him being driven from in shame. The second, and the one that made her hands tremble as she set the letter down, was that the harbor company Josiah Calder had named, the Cormorant Coastal Trading Company, had, over the decades since, been quietly absorbed in its holdings inherited through 2 generations of careful marriages and shrewd business by none other than the Averley family. The very man who had put her out into the cold with 11 days' notice was a great-nephew of the man who had, if this letter spoke true, paid to have 31 people drowned and an honest keeper's name ruined to protect a shipping contract. She sat with that knowledge through the whole of that first night in the cottage, wrapped in her coat against a hearth she had not yet dared to light for fear of drawing attention to a woman living in a condemned building, turning the tin box over in her hands, counting by lamplight the coins inside. Enough, she reckoned carefully, to see her through a hard winter and perhaps to begin real repairs on the tower itself. But it was not the money that kept her awake until the gulls began calling. At dawn, it was the 31 names Josiah had listed at the letter's end, families of the drowned, several of whose descendants, she realized with a slow chill, still lived and fished and worshipped in Cormorant Point to this day, never knowing the true reason the Nor'westers' light had failed that terrible night. Word travels fast in a town built around a single harbor, and it was not 2 weeks before Cormorant Point knew that the Calder woman was living out at the old Gull Point light, patching its roof board by board with lumber she could afford, hauling water from the point's old cistern, and, more curiously still, asking careful, pointed questions of the oldest fishermen in town about a wreck none of them liked to discuss. Ruth then moved slowly and deliberately, the way she always had, cross-referencing Josiah's letter against the old church burial records, against the faded harbor company ledgers she managed, with considerable nerve, to view at the county recorder's office under the pretense of researching lighthouse history, and against the memories of old man Hollis, the last living survivor of a family that had lost 2 sons on the Nor'wester, who wept openly when she showed him a single line from her grandfather's letter and confirmed that yes, his own father had always sworn on his deathbed that the light that night had been unnatural dark, gone out too clean and too sudden for any ordinary storm to account for. It did not take long for this quiet digging to reach Thomas Averley's ears, and when it did, his response was neither slow nor gentle. He came to the lighthouse himself on a raw November afternoon, his fine coat entirely wrong for the wind off the point, and informed Ruth Ann, with the same flat business-like coldness he'd used to evict her, that whatever old family stories she was digging up out here were both irrelevant and potentially slanderous, that the Averley name had built half the good in Cormorant Point over 3 generations, and that a woman in her position, penniless, unmarried, living alone in a condemned structure, would do well to consider how easily a man of his standing could have that structure recondemned and her put off the point entirely, letter or no letter. Ruth then, standing in her own doorway with the wind pulling at her skirts, felt real fear for the first time since the auction, not for herself alone, but for what it would mean if this letter simply vanished into the same silence that had swallowed her grandfather's name. But she also felt something hardened in her that had been softening for years under the weight of being told, again and again, that she did not matter. She told Thomas, quite calmly, that she had already made 2 careful copies of the letter, that one was in the keeping of the county recorder under seal as part of a historical inquiry, and that the other would go, along with sworn statement from old man Hollis and 2 other elderly witnesses, to the newspaper in Rockland the moment anything happened to her, her tower, or her good name. It was, in truth, only half accomplished when she said it, but Thomas Averley did not know that, and something in her flat, unhurried certainty, the same tone constant had always had made Ruth Ann sound older than her years even as a girl, made him believe her entirely. He left without another word, but not before Ruth Ann saw, beneath his anger, something that looked very much like fear, and she understood then that the truth she carried was worth far more to him buried than any $4 lighthouse could ever be worth to her. He did not stay away for long. A week later, a man Ruth Ann did not recognize, dressed too finely for point work, arrived at her door claiming to represent a Boston buyer interested in purchasing the lighthouse outright, and offering a sum that would have seemed, only a month before, like more money than Ruth Ann had ever expected to see in her lifetime. She understood at once whose money truly stood behind the offer, and she understood, too, that accepting it would mean the tower, and whatever record it still held within its walls and its history, would pass into hands that had every reason to see both quietly erased. She declined politely, and when the man returned 2 days later with a higher figure still, she declined again, this time less politely, informing him that the lighthouse was not, and had never been, for sale at any price, and that he was welcome to tell whoever had sent him that a Calder did not abandon a post twice in one family's lifetime. It was a small act of defiance measured against Thomas of Earle's considerable resources, but it cost her something real, for the offer had been genuinely tempting in the marrow of her bones, in the part of her that remembered exactly what it felt like to count $11 and wonder if it would be enough. Word of the confrontation, half heard by a fisherman mending nets within earshot of the point, spread through Cormorant Point faster than any storm warning, and within days Ruth had found herself the subject of a town meeting she had not called and had not been invited to but attended anyway, standing at the back of the hall with old man Hollis's frail hand resting on her arm for courage. The town's older families, those who had lost fathers and brothers and sons to the Nor'wester, wanted the full truth read aloud, whatever it cost the Averley name. The town's newer merchants, many of them beholden to Averley credit and Averley contracts, wanted the whole matter left in its grave where it had rested peacefully for 43 years. It was Ruth then, finally called forward though she had raised no hand to speak, who settled the room, not with accusation, but by reading her grandfather's letter aloud in full, in the same plain and steady voice she had used to read scripture over her mother's grave and her sister's, and by reminding the whole, gently but without flinching, that 31 families had spent 43 years believing their dead had been lost in nothing but weather and a drunk keeper's neglect, when in fact, they had been lost to greed with a name that still sat in the front pew every Sunday. She did not ask the town to punish Thomas of Earley. She asked them only to let the dead be honestly mourned. It was old man Hollis, standing on legs that shook with age and old grief both, who moved that the Harbor Board's original record be formally reopened and corrected, and it was a weight of 31 families' grief, finally given somewhere honest to go, that carried a motion through even over the objections of Averley's allies. Thomas of Earley did not go to prison. The crime, and the men who committed it, were 43 years buried themselves. But he lost, within a single winter, the harbor contract his family's name had quietly guaranteed for 3 generations, as ship captains and fishing outfits alike began, one by one, to take their business to men whose names carried no such shadow. And by spring he had sold the fine house on the hill and left Cormorant Point for good, his ambitions finally overtaken by the same silence he had once relied on to protect him. Ruth had used her grandfather's gold not to leave Cormorant Point, as she had once dreamed of doing, but to finish what he had started and never been allowed to finish honestly. She repaired the tower stair herself, board by board, through that whole winter, and petitioned the reconstituted Harbor Board, now led by men who trusted the Calder name again, to relight Gull Point not as a working federal beacon, which the new automated light on Matinicas had rendered unnecessary, but as a memorial station and a small museum housing the true and complete record of the Nor'wester, her grandfather's letter framed at its center. 31 names carved into a stone the town, raised together on the point that following summer. She used what remained of the coin to help 2 of the poorest fishing families through a hard season, quietly and without asking thanks, the way her mother had always mended nets, not for glory, but because the work was there to be done and she knew how to do it. She was 42 years old, and for the first time since her mother's death nearly 2 decades before, she was known in Cormorant Point not as a quiet, colder girl who kept to herself, but as a woman who had bought a lighthouse nobody wanted and, in doing so, had returned to an entire village something it had lost long before she was even born, the plain, unadorned truth about who its people had really been, and who had failed them. The dedication of the memorial stone took place the following June, on a bright, wind-scoured morning with a harbor full of boats decked out in bunting the fishing families had sown themselves, and Ruth stood at the base of her grandfather's tower, dressed in her mother's good dress let out at the seams, and watched as old man Hollis, too frail now to stand long, was helped to his feet by 2 of his grandsons to read the 31 names aloud one final time, before they were sealed into stone for good. She had not expected to weep, but she did, quietly, at the sound of her own family name spoken among the names of the honored dead, not as an accusation this time, but as a restoration, and she felt, standing there with salt wind pulling at her skates, that she had finally finished a piece of work her grandfather had begun and been forced to abandon, the way a keeper finishes tending a light even when the storm that put it out has long since passed. In the years that followed, she kept the lighthouse open through the warmer months for any traveler or townsperson who wished to climb the repaired stair and read the letter for themselves. Framed now beneath glass beside a small portrait of Josiah Calder that old man Hollis's family had, remarkably, kept tucked in an attic trunk of their own for 4 decades, never knowing why they'd bothered to save the face of a disgraced keeper none of them had ever properly known. We began this story with a woman of 41 standing on a courthouse step, cast out with $11 to her name and a town's quiet laughter following her toward a lighthouse everyone else had already given up for lost. We told you then that something sealed inside that tower would change her life and restore a village, and now you know the whole of it. That the $4 Ruth and Calder paid for condemned light was never really a foolish woman's last desperate gamble, but the closing of a circle her own grandfather had opened 4 decades before her, sealed in a wall and waiting, with a patience only a keeper could understand, for someone with Calder blood and a Calder's gift for finding value where the world saw only ruin. She did not set out to expose a wealthy family or right a 43-year wrong. She set out only to make one room warm enough to survive a winter in. But the same quiet attentiveness that let her find the strain in a torn sail, the same patience that let her sit with her dying mother and later her dying sister without flinching from either truth or silence, was exactly the gift her grandfather had counted on when he sealed his letter into that wall and hoped. Ruth and Calder did not become wealthy in any way the town of Cormorant Point would have measured before that autumn. She became, instead, something the town had never quite had before, a keeper, in the truest sense her grandfather had meant it, of both a light and a truth, and there are still nights, townspeople will tell you, when they walk the Point Road at dusk and see a single lamp burning steady in the old lantern room, though the beacon itself has not turned in decades, and they say it is only Ruth sitting up there with her mending in her father's old log book, watching over a harbor that finally, after 43 years, knows a whole of its own story. Children in Cormorant Point grow up now knowing her not as a cautionary tale about foolish spending or a woman who kept too much to herself, but as a keeper who came home, and on quiet evenings when the tide runs low and the gulls are gone still along the ledges, some of the old fishermen still say you can hear, faint beneath the wind, the sound of a woman humming her mother's old mending songs, patient as ever, tending to whatever small, forgotten thing still needs her care. Thank you for spending this time with Ruth and with us. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that value is so often hidden exactly where the world has stopped looking for it. We'd love to know, has there ever been a time in your own life when you found real worth in something everyone else had already written off? A person, a place, or perhaps even yourself? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone, and we always will. Until next time, stay close.